In Pursuit of Venus Infected is the final version of a work that I began a few years back. Initially it was called In Pursuit of Venus, and that was a 2-screen 8-minute work, or a 2-channel 8-minute work, and inspired by a French scenic or a French panoramic wallpaper called Les Sauvages de la Mer Pacifique. And it's on show downstairs, so you may want to have a look at that to see. When I initially saw this work, I was overseas, and what struck me about it was the idea that it was based on Maori and Pacific and Indigenous peoples from around the world. And yet when I looked at these figures, they looked neoclassical. So a few years later, I got invited to partake in an exhibition in Chicago. And what I loved about the Chicago gallery, or one of the galleries, had 10 projectors, a permanent installation for a multi-channel work, which spanned 80 feet by 10 feet. The Jackman Goldwasser Gallery, which is my next port of call, is to get this work there. But as a media artist or a filmmaker, I feel like a filmmaker who works in the art world. I really, when they asked us what we'd like to do, I wasn't thinking content. I was thinking of getting my sticky fingers all over these projectors and into this gallery space. The gallery space itself was really interesting because it's very long and seamless, using a watch-out rig, which is what we're using here. But what was interesting about it is that you projected from inside the gallery in the daytime. So it's like a catwalk space. They actually call it a catwalk gallery. So you walk right next to the image. At night time, they use a different set of blinds and they project, and then there's a whole series of apartment buildings across the road. About 5,000 people stare into this gallery, and so then you see the work at night time, but from a very different perspective. So one's kind of close up, and the other one's from far away. One operates in public space, and the other is kind of a much more kind of personal, private, up close thing. So I found that really interesting idea, because then you start to think about scale and how big people are, or if you're going to use figures, what scale they are. Do you diminish them so that you feel bigger than them, or do you make them bigger so that's so that it's that kind of what's the story of the woman through the looking glass? She gets big and small. So Alice, you can always play with those aspects of it. So when I thought, okay, I want to work with this technology, but there's no good. You need really good content, I think. There's no point in putting a lot of resources and time and energy into something unless you've got something really strong to say. And it was at that point when I was casting about trying to think of what would translate, what would be worthwhile trying to put some imagery into that space, that I came across the catalogue of the show that we'd seen many, many years before about this French scenic wallpaper. Now, the French scenic wallpaper is really interesting because of its time, it was a technical feat. It took 1,000 wood blocks to create the work. It talks about the history of paper making, the fact that at this point in time, it was the first time that paper was being made in long strips. And so for me, it kind of intersects with some of the ideas that I think around technology as a woman. I've previously thought of the computer as a carving tool. I like to think of it as a weaving tool as well, as a space that you gather material and you refine it and you weave things together to tell stories. Computers come from the textile industry, so there's this kind of fabric that talks about who we are as people and as females. So it's just a way that I like to think through the technology that I work with, but I really like pushing and challenging myself in terms of the technology that I want to work with, but also the stories that I want to tell. So the story that I wanted to tell was to look at this wallpaper and bring real people into it. So to animate it and bring it back to life, but bring it back to life with real people. So it's kind of a speaking back. It's a reply across time. The original wallpaper was made, I think, in about 1804. I could be wrong. I can check those dates. But also that wallpaper was inspired by the explorers of the Pacific. So it was Captain Cook, because he was so famous. And the French, of course, were travelling through the Pacific as well. So they had people such as de la Perouse. So it's a speaking back across history and time from a contemporary perspective, and looking through all those different lenses in many, many different ways, be it about science, about history making, about colonisation, about performative Pacific bodies, about costume, about animation, about gender politics. So there's many, many things that I really wanted to explore and kind of roll into this project. And it's also, people say that we have a short attention span, and I don't believe that. It's a bit like, say, many years ago, people were saying that broadcast medium needed to talk down and find a common denominator. I don't subscribe to that way of thinking. I think if you put something really interesting in front of people, even if they don't get the gist of everything, they will get what they can hear and understand, and they may be inspired to learn more. And so I think, for me, that's a little bit like hearing whai kōrero. I was brought up in an urban environment. My dad left the far north. We hail from Otawa. He came to Auckland to make money to send home. So and as a father, as a man, he was out working, and my mother's English. So I don't have ready tools for te reo, but I love hearing it. I don't mind listening to it. I don't mind listening to the radio, putting on Maori television, hearing it. And there's words that'll capture me, but there's a sound, and that sound is the sound of my culture, and I think you can rest there and use that as a source. And so my next thing I'm thinking about next year is not even making work, but trying to learn te reo, which is going to be so hard. But maybe it's only just as hard as some of the other projects that I've embarked on. Was think about the pixel ratio, because once we'd set the pixel scale, that is as big as the work can ever be projected. So I decided to future-proof the work, and the work that's on show at the moment is only half resolution, and we can't play it because the technology is still catching up. But I wanted to do that because I want to make works that last a long time. There's a lot of resourcing and time and thinking that's gone into it. So once we'd set the pixel resolution, I worked with a Russian illustrator, and he based the background and the trees on the original wallpaper. And then we did a series of 1.5 day green screen shoot just to drop things in and see what we needed to learn from that. And one of the things we decided is that the sun is set at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So each time that we would set up another shoot, we had a kind of lighting plan so that when everything sits in that space, it looks like it's pretty much... It's not that it has to happen at the same time, but it just aesthetically, it makes it easy for all the works to sit alongside each other. So there's some pieces of filming in there that were shot 4 years ago that are sitting next to stuff that we shot in April of 2014. The other thing one of the things that we discovered is the hardest, and actually was a very time-consuming and difficult part of the project, was to make the shadows, because we had to generate the shadows, draw them, rotoscope them, and add them in, and it was the last thing that we did. But what the shadows do is add a kind of believability. The figures don't look like they're stuck on, and it sits between a two-dimensional space and the live action 3D video filming. So it sits somewhere between them, and even as a technique, it's taking the movement of the live action but turning it into an illustration that moves with them. So it's kind of the glue that gives it a beautiful cohesion to the piece. The other thing, some of the stuff that's really hard was to think about the sound design. There's so much going on, and in fact, it was only three weekends before the opening of the show that I finally heard the work, because we'd been working in computers, so we used a number. Mostly, it's created or composited in After Effects, and it's a very huge project. It's crazy when you see how big and deep and layered it is. So it wasn't until the end, once we'd put everything into an order, that we could, what you call rendering out the sound, and then hear the sound. And then when I heard the sound, because I've been looking at the editing for a year, about a good year we'd been editing, but without sound, and then suddenly it was really noisy. So that was quite a surprise for me. So then picking through and deciding what to put in and what not to put in. And so then those are... they're sound design issues, but they're also issues that are to do completely with the philosophy of the project. So in the scene where Captain Cook is being revered as Lono, there are Samoan priests. They're acting as the Hawaiian priests. And for them to be in that role, one of the actors led it, and he's doing his prayers, his chant, and he's chanting in Samoan. So it was really an interesting decision whether to have a scene that kind of looks like it's Hawaiian, because those authenticity issues are visual as well as sound and language, or whether to take his voice away and then just have it silent. And so some of the biggest decisions I had was about, as Indigenous people, or even for the position of the actors, that they're having an authentic response as actors, thinking about these situations that happened in the past and how they were in amidst it. So, so there's a whole lot of thinking and issues that, when I take it to Hawaii, when it finally gets there, it will be really interesting to see what the feedback is, because that is the decision that I decided to make as the maker of the work, is to not take Indigenous voices away as much as possible. Sometimes I did and sometimes I didn't, but these are the real philosophical issues that are embedded in the work, and they're not perfect, but I decided that that if people take offence and I know about it, perhaps that becomes an opportunity to repay somehow and create a relationship that is an ongoing relationship. So that's across time outside of the work that I think continues the discussions that we as Indigenous people have with each other, and that an artwork can just sit as a place and it can be very effective in its own right, but that it creates another space for discussion, and ongoing discussion in a really fruitful way. So that's where I had to come and feel very comfortable with myself about that, because most of the works leading up till now that I've personally undertaken, have been around Maori culture, although I've worked with a lot of Pacific people, and I've worked with a group called Pacific Sisters, and we've done a whole lot of stuff together. So it's kind of opened up that space to look at a bigger picture, and this work is all about a bigger picture. So I really, my biggest sadness about this work is I really wanted to go to Sydney and shoot a couple of scenes with Aboriginal Koori people, but I had deadlines and fun. You know, I've mostly self-funded this work, so I needed to get it finished. So I've decided that perhaps that's something I couldn't fit everything in one place. So perhaps that's something that comes later, or there's another discussion that can come. Something really fruitful can come from that. So this is an incredibly complex work, and I'm big, bad and ugly enough now. I'm 50, so it's a fantastic moment in time to make a really strong work. For me, it's a real marker of what I've learned in the past to get to where I am today. And it combines a whole lot of techniques and processes that I've been accruing over many, many years. And to be able to shoot these scenes really talks to me about a project that you and I worked on, as in Karen Sidney, with Melissa Reihana many years ago, called Native Portraits, where I was looking at the camera and how the camera was recording how we come to see ourselves because of the photographs, which become beautiful archives and taonga. So for me, that was the first time that I'd done costume drama, and they were little short sequences. And so I think, talking about short films, I love short films. I think they're a wonderful storytelling device. And I really like operating in the art world, because the thing about the art world that's different to broadcast is there's different time signatures. So broadcast might operate at whether it's 15-minute, 30-minute, whatever a time slot is, and it's about broadcasting maybe once or twice wide. In the art world, it's kind of like a narrow casting, but there's a different time that happens with it. So what I'm finding with this work is people are coming back again and again because there's so much to see. Each scene takes 4 minutes to get from one side across to the other, and there's 70 different scenes in there. So collectively, it's a big story, but each story is quite short. But each story might embody a whole lot of ideas, notions, concepts. So there's a hilarious scene which is based on the journal entries, and it was in Tahiti. And the arioi were like travelling minstrels, and they used to perform for their food, perform for their supper. And it described a man giving birth to a man. And so the other thing that I discovered about the arioi, they were a very specific class. They were tattooed, and they practiced infanticide, so they would kill their own children. So I wanted to roll the story and embody that notion in it as well. So it's a hilarious scene because you're seeing this guy giving birth to a guy who's got a beard. I chose a bearded man, and he's kind of crying like a baby and what have you. But then there's this gorgeous young woman, clearly pregnant, who comes out with a weapon to go to kill the body and then to go and cut herself. So, so these things are kind of funny. They talk about even in England, the whole kind of populist theatre, pantomime culture. that there were these things that, in these moments of encounter, there were things that people recognised and liked in each other, but then there were other culturally specific things that were quite hard to come to terms with. So people are coming again and again to see what's happening, and that's really good because it means they're interested in trying to work out what's going on. But the presentation itself, it's at scale, it's beautiful because this is the most gorgeous installation. And some, various people say, I want to know more, not quite sure what's going on. And so in a way, you're bearing witness. It's almost like for the first time, you're an explorer and you're seeing it too. So it's trying to put people into these slightly off-kilter moments, but if you're interested enough, you'll come back and learn more. And so for me, it's that learning that's really important. And I'm not a historian, I'm an artist, so I want to show the work as an artist would. And it gave me a little space for leeway, as did the wallpaper. There's a couple of scenes in there that have got nothing to do with any Pacific culture at all. They're actually completely made up. Just a couple. One of them were the Turtle Boys because we dressed them up and made them a kind of crew. But also there's a beautiful scene. There's just some chiefs talking and chatting and with very glamorous headdresses on, and that comes directly from the wallpaper. So it's authentic to the wallpaper, which is not authentic, but so it's a nice space to play in as an artist.